There was one particular moment on a day 176 years ago when a Bunurong man named Polyarong, who was known to the settlers as Billy Lonsdale, was leaning against the door of a hut somewhere in the brickfields on the south side of the Yarra, just over there, probably in the vicinity of the present-day Alexandra Gardens. And Polyarong was watching the recently arrived Assistant Protector of Aborigines, William Thomas, walking towards Melbourne. The two men struck up a bit of a conversation and they travelled across the river, pre-bridge days, on the punt. And Polyarong started to teach the white man the names of the trees and the birds and other natural features. And as the brickmakers on the other side of the river were fashioning the bricks which were the building blocks of Melbourne, of this ever-growing settlement, Polyarong told Thomas the story of Bunjil, the creator, who had made the Kulin from the very same clay that was making Melbourne. So this place just over the river that's the subject of our discussions tonight is in many respects, I think, a real meeting point, the kind of beating heart, if you like, of the city, I think, in so many respects. My name's Andrew May. I'm a Professor of History at the University of Melbourne. I'm the MC tonight, and I'm absolutely delighted to have been asked to act in that capacity to moderate this evening's conversation. And it's in the context of discussion around the Domain Parkland Master Plan. So tonight we're putting some kind of coherence, if you like, around the notion of the Domain Parklands. And I think it's the kind of best sort of history and the best sort of placemaking. It's historical, it's a celebration. In a sense, it's informative about how we get to inherit the space that we have over the river there. And hopefully we'll learn things along the way that we didn't know before. And I do think it's an extraordinary place. It's extraordinary, but it's also a very ordinary place. And I think that combination is a very productive one to think about. It's a place I think that's often taken for granted in the psyche of Melbourne. It's emblematic in some ways of the city, very much part of the city's psyche. So many things have happened there and continue to happen there over time. It's a place of amenity, infrastructure, recreation, aesthetics, commemoration, science, labour, you name it. So many things have happened in this place. It's a place for going through as much as a place for going to, which lends interesting aspects to its history and the way it's thought about. And we'll hear from a range of speakers about how these things have come to pass. I think one interesting thing about it is the way that we think about it in our mental maps of the city. There's an American geographer in the early 60s, Kevin Lynch, who wrote a book called The Image of the City. And he was one of the first to talk about the ways that we carry around a cognitive map of place. And some places are better known than others. We kind of remember landmarks or routes or nodes or edges or regions. And a community kind of, if you overlay all those mental maps of a place, you can get a consolidated sense of how people imagine and think about cities. And I think the Domain Parklands area is both one that is well imagined and well visioned, if you like, in some ways, but I think there's also areas that are less well known. And part of what we're doing tonight, I think, is trying to draw some of those, join some of those dots on the map. So what I'll do first is introduce our speakers and then invite them individually to come to the stage. They'll talk for about 8-10 minutes at the most, one after the other. So your job is to jot down some questions and comments, and at the end of the 4 speakers, we'll invite some questions from the audience. There'll be a roving mic and we can carry on the conversation. Georgina Whitehead is a director of Jones and Whitehead. She's a landscape architect specialising in urban public spaces. Georgina's undertaken significant research into the history of parkland in Melbourne and regional Victoria. Her terrific book, if you haven't got a copy, Civilising the City, was published in the 90s but has just been republished. It's a terrific atlas, if you like, of some of these kind of public spaces in the city and how they've evolved. It's based on extensive research in pictures and other cartography and so on, looking at the development of Melbourne's gardens collectively. Following Georgina, we will have John Hawker. John is a horticulturalist with Heritage Victoria, and he's previously worked in a number of capacities with the Botanic Gardens and the Department of Planning. At Heritage Victoria, John's involved in assessing the significance of places, including trees, gardens and cemeteries and so on. Another way of saying that is probably he knows more about elm trees, I think, than the collective posse here tonight. Dr. Matthew Klugman is the Deputy Director of the Sport in Society Research Program at Victoria University. And so he researches and teaches in the history of sport, people who love and hate sport, the intersection of sport and passions and emotions and religion and migration, a really useful way to track cultural aspects and cultural change. His most recent book, Black and Proud, the story of an iconic AFL photo, co-authored book, received the New South Wales Premier's Literary Award. So needless to say, it's a good week to be a sports historian as well, I think, in Melbourne. And then wrapping up will be Stuart Harrison. Stuart's an architect, writer, broadcaster, director of an award-winning architectural practice in Melbourne, and is a design review expert. And he's taught widely in design and architectural history at RMIT and at Monash University. So that's our panel, and without further ado, I'll invite our first speaker to the mic, Georgina Whitehead, who will set the scene a little for the history of the Domain Parklands.
Good. It's a speedy look at the development of the Domain. So, settlement of the Port Phillip district by Europeans coincided with the introduction of English social planning reforms, embodied in the then new idea of providing people living in large and overcrowded cities with public parks and gardens. Melbourne was, of course, for many years surrounded and permeated by open space, but right from the start, people believed their bush settlement was destined to become a great metropolis. It was thought that attractively laid out grounds with trees and flowers, which allowed the different social classes to enjoy fresh air and exercise together, would improve everybody's physical health, education and moral character. Parks and gardens were seen as integral to Melbourne's development as a civilised and modern city. The high ground overlooking Melbourne was first reserved in 1841 as parkland for a viceregal residence, although Government House wasn't actually built for another 30 years. In the 1850s, Ferdinand von Mueller, as director of the Botanic Gardens and responsible for managing the Domain, envisaged it as a place of science wherein people could enjoy leisure pursuits. Beyond the boundary of the Botanic Gardens proper, he planted thousands of trees arranged in taxonomic groupings and built a small museum to house his botanical collection. The observatory was established within this scientific framework in the early 1860s. With the eventual decision to proceed with construction of Government House, a plan by Joseph Sayce to transform Mueller's mixed eucalypt and pine forest to an ornamental park as a setting for the mansion was approved in 1873, and work began immediately. The lagoon by Prince's Bridge was transformed into a modified version of Sayce's Lake, but few features of this very elaborate plan were actually constructed for reasons of cost. The subsequent intention was to make the domain a well-arranged public park, but even this required greater resources than the government at that time was prepared to allocate. It wasn't really until the beginning of the 20th century that the domain started to take on a more urban character of the sort perhaps originally envisaged. As foreseen, the bush settlement had grown into marvellous Melbourne, and the domain was no longer on the outskirts but comfortably ensconced within the metropolitan area. The first catalyst for its transformation was the straightening and widening of the Yarra to prevent flooding, which used to inundate South Melbourne. This enormous project also incorporated beautification of the Yarra's south bank. Under the direction of the Italian-born engineer Carlo Catani, the original idea to form a road by the river's edge, 20 metres or so wide, along the lines of Rotten Row in London, was given a more imaginative and comprehensive treatment. Alexandra Avenue, named after the Queen, was declared open by her son, the future King George V, who was here to open Australia's first federal parliament. It was over 60 metres wide and comprised a carriage drive banned to commercial traffic, riding tan, bike path and footpath, all lined with avenues of trees. Alexandra Park incorporated the new boulevard and riverbank, as well as Linlithgow Avenue, which was also new, and associated parkland to St Kilda Road, while the Alexandra Gardens were laid out between the boat sheds and Alexandra Avenue. By the time Queen Victoria had died, and you can possibly see the different, it's very small, but you can possibly see the different parks and gardens there. By the time Queen Victoria had died at the start of 1901, Melbourne, named after her first Prime Minister, had grown into a city of over 500,000. It was decided to erect a memorial statue in honour of the late Queen in the triangle of land between Alexandra and Linlithgow Avenues. An artificial mound was built on which to place the ornate monument because it was considered important for it to be visible from St Kilda Road. This reflects a significant change in public attitudes towards the use of parks and gardens. No longer were they only considered necessary for public health and social cohesion, but had become adornments to the city in their own right, to be enjoyed from afar by people going about their daily business. A large area in the southwest corner of the domain was chosen as the site for the Shrine of Remembrance, begun in 1927. The design was inspired by the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, the tomb of Mausolus, and one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. The shrine's architects considered its siting analogous to the Athenian Acropolis. In those days, if you were to be thought educated, it was important to have enjoyed a classical education. And these allusions to classical antiquity demonstrated Melbourne's civility and culture. The long approach to the shrine took its inspiration from another place and time, as it was proposed to use the, quote, magnificent approach to the Taj Mahal as model. In 1933, 17 hectares was excised from Government House Reserve to become part of the new 31-hectare King's Domain. Hugh Lineker drew up a landscape design which also included the shrine. In a bid to reconcile the picturesque landscaping around Government House with the strong geometry of the shrine, he created a park of specimen trees interlaced with meandering paths, which were criticised at the time as leading hither and thither with no definite objective. When a memorial to King George V was proposed, Lineker suggested that King's Domain was a suitable location because the new park needed important features to add interest and dignity. George V was only the first in a long line of such features that have found a home in the domain right up to the present day. In fact, he wasn't the first. Queen Victoria would have been the first. The practical value ascribed by the 19th century Parks and Gardens movement, which made it a place for social interaction, entertainment and exercise, is now in competition with the domain's symbolic value by virtue of the proliferation of memorials. The inclusion of the Sydney Mire Music Bowl, which opened in 1959, was partly influenced by the proximity of the Botanic Gardens, in which music recitals of various kinds had taken place since its inception. Unfortunately, the original concept of providing cultural enrichment by way of free concerts has been eroded by commercial exploitation, leading to the area now managed by the Victorian Arts Centre being almost doubled in size and fenced off from the rest of the park. So the domain has changed enormously since its first iteration as a place of science with the Botanic Gardens at its heart. While significant events and available resources have helped shape it over time, it's also necessarily reflected changing attitudes and values, fashion and technology. And undoubtedly future Melburnians will be just as influenced by ongoing changes in society, and the domain as we know it today will continue to evolve, and the story will just go on. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Georgina. It's just wonderful to have the pictorial images up here and be looking out onto the over the river to the places that we're talking about. Okay, now I'd like to invite John Hawker to speak to us on the horticultural and planting history of this giant space.
Thanks, Andy, and thank you for the opportunity to speak about the domain parkland trees. A place that's been included on the Victorian Heritage Register since 2013 and was the final piece in the jigsaw that was to be included on the State Register. And in fact, it's worth noting that I believe that all of the domain, the Shrine of Remembrance, the Queen Victoria Gardens, the Alexandra Gardens, Government House and the Botanic Gardens you see in this image is worthy of a national listing, and it's perhaps something for the future the City of Melbourne might like to consider with the Botanic Gardens. This oblique aerial photograph was taken just before the construction of the 1959 Sydney Mire Music Bowl, which is located in that kind of clear area on the upper right-hand side. And the similarity across the place should not be unexpected, as both Mueller and later Guilfoyle were responsible for all of the area, setting down the foundation planting. So this treed landscape has a similar pattern, whether you walk through the current domain, through the Huntingfield lawn, into the Botanic Gardens, to the very eucalyptus lawn, and right through to the south area of the South Domain, between Domain Road and Birdwood Avenue. And I'll explain more of those features later in my talk. It was Ferdinand von Mueller who was appointed the government botanist in 1852 and then the director of the Botanic Gardens in 1857 who set down the first plantings. And in July 1873, William Guilfoyle was appointed curator of the Botanic Gardens, Government House grounds and the domain. He became the director in 1876. A major landscape change occurred in 1927 with the construction of the shrine, and in 1933 a new landscape plan was prepared for the shrine precinct by Hugh Lineker. It also included many conifers, eucalypts and trees favoured by both Guilfoyle and Mueller. In 1933, part of the grounds were reduced in the grounds of Government House were reduced in size, and a new boundary arranged, and that land was incorporated into the domain parkland. Botanically, the landscape includes a number of includes remnant native vegetation, rare and threatened species, important cultivars, historic trees and commemorative trees. Outstanding examples of the species and avenues and specimen trees. I'll discuss a few of these significant trees in this presentation. This view of gums, cypress, oaks and elms in the background happens to be south of Birdwood Avenue, not far from the current 1934 herbarium. But similar views can occur throughout the domain, to the west of the observatory, to the north of the Pioneer Women's Memorial Garden, the Hunting Field lawn, and parts of the Botanic Gardens and the South Domain. It's a landscape character that really is spread across all of the place. The tree in the foreground is a Eucalyptus sideroxylon rosea. The grey gums in the background are Eucalyptus punctata and Eucalyptus prinqua. Very rare in cultivation, the only other plants occurring in the Royal Botanic Gardens. And the tree on the far right is an unusual and rare upright Monterey cypress. The collection of eucalypts in the domain is outstanding and include many timber species, including the kauri from Western Australia, the ironbark, grey gum, the Sydney blue gum, flooded gum, spotted gum, and river peppermint, just a few examples. It's also of interest that there are numerous flowering gums, now Corymbia phycifolia and the Maori Corymbia calophylla. And in fact, a hybrid between these species was once known as a variety Guilfoylii, and it's known that Guilfoyle grew a range of various colour forms of Maori gum trees, and few of these still remain on the observatory site and also in the domain itself. In 1860, Mueller reported that avenues of elms and alternating trees and eucalypts were planted and weeping willows around the lagoons. Blue gums had planted along the St Kilda Road and silky oaks and Illawarra flame trees were chosen. And for his extensive blue gum plantings, Mueller earned the name Blue Gum Mueller. He favoured conifers, and by 1865, more than 2,780 mixed conifers, including 1,000 pines, had been planted in the domain, over 7,000 in Government House Reserve, and over 1,200 in the Botanic Gardens. So really, his plantings of conifers in the domain was a highly significant part of his acclimatisation work in and around the Botanic Gardens. This scan of part of the 1869 plan, drawn under the direction of Mueller, shows domain tree planting at this time. It includes Ficus macrophylla, Eucalyptus globulus, Eucalyptus calophylla, many cypress, junipers, redwoods, oaks, poplars, willows, elms, abies, picea, araucaria, calitris, and many pines, including Pinus insignis, now known as Pinus radiata, and referred to by Mueller as the remarkable pine. Also of interest are the stands of Pinus canariensis to the left of the observatory site. There are two triangular areas there. These trees still remain but have been incorporated into the observatory reserve, and also in one of the diagonal avenues across to St Kilda Road, the word Pistachia terebinthus occurs, and this is now Shinus terebinthifolius, and there are 3 trees of those that remain between the shrine and the observatory. The tree on the right is a Monterey pine. Pinus radiata was introduced in December 1857 on the Duncan Dunbar to the Sydney and Melbourne and Hobart Botanic Gardens. And it was also listed by Adcock's Nursery in Geelong in 1857. The species had been reintroduced into England by David Douglas, the collector, in 1833. The Monterey cypress, the large tree in the centre, formerly Cypressus and now Hesperocyprus macrocarpa, was first grown in Victoria from 1857. What is interesting about both these conifers is that they are very rare in the wild in California and are only known in a few populations. However, it's probably the most popular and widely cultivated conifer now in the world. And of course, the Monterey pine is the most important softwood timber tree throughout the globe. The Moreton Bay fig on the right is part of the avenue of along South Yarra Drive, now known as Birdwood Avenue, that was constructed in 1874 and planted under the guidance of Guilfoyle, either around 1874 or perhaps 1903, depending on which reference you look at. A bit more research, I dare say. So this is an image of the Mueller's 1869 plan that shows extensive tree plantings, miscellaneous oaks, lots of conifers, and amongst this plan 2 rows of Quercus ilex, the holly oak, and also Olea europaea, the olive. And today we still have these trees surviving in the South Domain. The Quercus ilex was available in Australia from 1827 and the olive from 1805. So the Domain landscape is a place of layers of change. The Queen Victoria statue, the shrine, the Pioneer Women's Peace Memorial Garden, the extension of the gardens, the Domain into what was formerly Government House grounds, and of course the Sydney Myer Music Bowl in 1959. Similarly, the landscape experiences even greater changes with that trees die, and very few of those Mueller-era trees now remain. One of the most important trees introduced into the landscape was in 1933, the lone pine, and this grew here until 3 years ago, and as a 79-year-old tree, that is, I regard, fairly young, and it's unfortunate and normally would be expected to perhaps live almost double that in age. Interestingly, this is not the first commemorative planting, and I thank Angela Hill for this information, but on the 25th of April 1916, and this is probably the very first commemorative planting to the Gallipoli landing, 2 flowering gums, a Murray pine, 2 wattles, a Gippsland mahogany, which would almost certainly be Eucalyptus botryoides, and a New South Wales Tristania were planted near the South African Memorial under the direction of John Conan, who was the director of the Melbourne Botanic Gardens. This is a part scan of the 1911 plan showing the original Government House boundary, just roughly between the O and the V in government. And the plan also shows the Alexandra Gardens and the layout and the palm planting on Henley Lawn, and the dates from 1909. The planting in this area is hard to read, but to the left and the right of the palms are 2 wattle plantations on the eastern and the western sides. The Government House boundary was altered in 1933 and the area transformed into the Domain Parklands. Importantly, a number of trees still remain from this period. This includes the rare Electrion subcinereus, the smooth rambutan, a species listed as an endangered in Victoria. That's an image of the fruit, quite easy to grow from those seeds, incidentally, but rarely cultivated. And the only known trees is a tree in the St Kilda Botanic Gardens, 7 trees in the Melbourne Gardens, and a tree at Magunya, the former home of Russell Grimwade in Toorak. The other trees to the right are Elaeodendron crocium, a red saffron, a poisonous plant from South Africa, and a Syncarpia glamifera, a turpentine from New South Wales and Queensland, again both rarely grown in Victoria. And in the early 1990s there was also a Rus viminalis in this area that has now been removed. It died. The tree on the left is the last remaining wattle in that 1909 plantation on Henley Lawn. And it's just not any ordinary wattle, which is interesting because there would have been quite a plantation there, according to the plan. It's actually a rare Acacia maideni, maiden's wattle from Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, and it's listed as an endangered species in Victoria. And an interesting aside is it was named by Mueller in 1895 after Joseph Maiden, the New South Wales government botanist. It's not known in cultivation. There are none in the Botanic Gardens collection, and the only tree I'm aware of is in the Burnley Gardens on the main lawn. The tree on the right is perhaps the most important tree in the Domain. It's a rare Piconia excelsa from the Canary Islands. It's listed as vulnerable on the IUCN list and occurs only in fragmented communities in the cloud forests above 1,000 metres. With Stuart Reid from New South Wales Heritage, we have listed all the known trees. There are 11 in New South Wales, 11 in Victoria, which includes 3 in the Melbourne Gardens and 4 at the Geelong Botanic Gardens, and there are 6 in South Australia. There's a nice one at Melbourne University near the entrance to Wilson Hall. What's interesting about this tree is that we've never seen it listed in any nursery catalogues at all, and the very largest I've seen is at Camden Park in New South Wales. Here are a group of eucalypts that you'll see throughout the reserve, and as I mentioned earlier, the eucalypt collection is absolutely outstanding. The trees on the left are Eucalyptus fibrosa. It's broad-leaved red ironbark from New South Wales and Queensland, and the only other known trees of this species are 3 trees at Lake Waroona in Bendigo, and perhaps it's a happy coincidence, but it was where Guilfoyle produced the design in 1878 as well. So we've got 3 trees in the domain, 3 trees in Bendigo. The central tree is the largest spotted gum, Corymbia maculata. It's 32 metres high and 30 metres wide, and its girth of 4.2 metres. It's a tree that's 2 to 3 times larger than you'd expect to find in the wild. And the beautiful tree on the right-hand side is a Eucalyptus punctata, a grey box from New South Wales and Queensland. And to quote Roger Elliott, the trunks can become quite colourful at certain times of the year. If you go there now, it just looks like an ordinary grey gum. And quickly on to the next group of interesting conifers. I'm quite a fan of conifers as well as elms, but the tree on the left is a Hesperocyprus glabra, formerly Cupressus glabra, Hodgkinsii, that originated in the Hodgkins nursery in Essendon in 1936. The central tree is an Araucaria hunsteinii, the clinky pine from New Guinea. It's listed as a threatened species on the IUCN list, and the only other known tree is one of a similar size in the Botanic Gardens just north of the tea rooms. And the tree on the right is a Hesperocyprus macrocarpa bruniana aurea. It was released by Brunnings Nursery of St Kilda in about 1915. And this is rare in cultivation. In fact, more than half the known population occur in the domain, and it's now been reduced to about 7 trees. And of course, these Victorian raised cultivars to a horticulturalist are quite interesting and important to preserve. And finally, a few trees where Mueller, Guilfoyle and later curators actually had no involvement. These are the remnant river red gums that once grew along the south side of the lagoon. And that tree in the left foreground is a river red gum, Eucalyptus cameldulensis, and a fairly similar size to the river red gum that occurs on the Princess Lawn in the Botanic Gardens. So there are about 6 of these trees that still survive. So thank you.
Thank you, John. It's wonderful to hear from someone who knows all these trees literally by name. It's an extraordinary wisdom there. There's no other way of saying this, but I'm going to handball now to Matthew Klugman to consider aspects of the history and culture and heritage of sports associated with the domain area.
Thanks, Andy. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be here tonight. When we think of Melbourne as the sporting capital of Australia and a sporting centre of the world, we think of major sporting events such as the upcoming Grand Final and the Boxing Day Test at the MCG, along with other sporting spectacles north of the Yarra, such as the Australian Open and the Melbourne Cup. Yet the migrants I've spoken to who live around the parklands of the domain area are struck by all the local sporting activities that they encounter, by the people running, jogging, cycling, skating, as well as those straining to meet the urging of personal trainers or stretching and moving in poses inspired by yoga or a litany of martial arts. Often the migrants join in. It's another side of our sporting culture and one that's just as emblematic of Melbourne. But if we go back in time, we find traces of different sporting cultures as well as the seeds of the present. There's obviously too much to cover here in detail, so what I just want to give is just a brief taste of what it was like back in those days past and how it's come to be as it is now by looking at a couple of examples. Pre-invasion, the peoples of the Kulin Nation, including the Woiwurrung and the Bunurong, enjoyed contests involving the throwing of sticks, spears and boomerangs, among other sporting activities. Unfortunately, little is known of these and other practices that occurred in the Domain Parklands. In the post-invasion period, these parklands became for a while the centre of Melbourne's spectator sport culture. And the sport, though we don't think of it now as a huge spectator sport, the sport then was rowing. And the southern banks of the Yarra, as you can see, were its main home. The Melbourne Regatta was formed in 1860, and by 1869 there were 10 clubs, and rowing was such a popular spectacle that other sports, such as Australian rules football, were scheduling their games to avoid the rowing clashing with the rowing regattas. When the Henley on the Yarra rowing event was first held in March 1904, it was so successful that it was held again November of the same year. An annual event from then on, it was held just before the Melbourne Cup each year, and the Henley on the Yarra was Melbourne's top social and sporting event until the advent of the Second World War. Indeed, crowds often exceeding 100,000 gathered along the banks of the Yarra to see the action. In 1925, for example, an estimated 150,000 people witnessed Australia's greatest river carnival, to quote the title of the headline of the Referee newspaper. Their report of the event began as follows. The weather was gloriously fine and the banks of the river from Princess Bridge were thronged with people who sported multicoloured dresses, gay blazers and parasols. On the water there were brilliantly decorated canoes and pleasure boats and houseboats of great beauty. To provide for the record number of entries, it was necessary to run 45 races between 12:15 p.m. and 4:50 p.m. in the afternoon. The carnival was so popular that it was broadcast on the wireless by Melbourne's ABC radio station, which was then known as 3LO. So you can see a bit of it there, I think, this kind of extraordinary gathering. One of the photos held in the State Library, Victoria, and we get another sense of it here as well. So a great kind of carnivalesque atmosphere with the rowing in the middle, but crowding boats. And the colours of it just sound like they were extraordinary. 1925 was also the year that there were public requests for the extension of what became known as the Tan Track. Originally a 1-mile equestrian track used by those privileged enough to own horses and covered in tan bark to help ease their hooves, hence the name Tan. The Tan was first extended in 1935 to a length of 1.5 miles, or close to 2.5 kilometres. A more major extension, however, occurred in 1974 when the Melbourne City Council and Victorian State Government remodelled the Tan into a fun and fitness track. Now circumnavigating the entire Domain and Botanical Gardens, the track measured almost 4 kilometres and was replete with exercise stations to encourage various forms of activity that seemed to complement the running and walking that now largely replaced the horse riding. A year later, and the Tan became one of the centrepieces of a pioneering public health campaign, Life Be In It. The brainchild of the Victorian Minister for Youth, Sport and Recreation, Brian Dixon, a prominent former Australian rules footballer, the Life Be In It campaign used irreverent cartoons that you can get a glimpse of there with a fun name, exercisements and other such terms. They used these irreverent cartoons to promote the serious cause of exercise and recreation. It had a refreshingly broad definition of recreation that kind of fits into some of the other talks tonight. You can see this included gardening and later even promoted the saving of energy as well. The campaign was deemed such a success that it was taken up by the federal government in 1977, and with television advertisements also being aired in some areas of the United States in the late 70s and early 80s, with different accents. The tan has been used by professional athletes such as AFL teams, and most famously Cathy Freeman, who based herself in Melbourne from 1990 and reportedly used the tan as part of her training for the 2000 Olympics in Sydney. But in keeping with the vision of those who remodelled it, the tan has been used by many others for fun as well as fitness, including those who work in the CBD and those who live in the surrounding areas. One eclectic group that captures much of what the tan has offered is the Melbourne Midday Milers, a group that dates back to 1978, so just 4 years into the tan, and is made up by people from all walks of life who love running and do so in the middle of many weekdays. So if the tan has become the site which best represents the transition from spectacle to the pleasures of recreation for its own sake rather than for an audience, the Yarra has of late become renowned for a different type of spectacle that I'm going to use to end this brief sample of sport and recreation that's characterised the Domain Parklands. Rowing remains a serious and important sport that uses the Yarra, and the fact that the awesome foursome trained on the Yarra is testament to this. But a more outlandish performance has gained great attention over the last 40 or so years, the Birdman Rally, which has become a part of the Moomba festivities. Not every year, but most years. Beginning in 1976, just 2 years after the tan was remodelled and 1 year after the Life Be In It campaign began, the even more reverent Birdman Rally involves attempts at flying over the Yarra that are often athletic as well as silly. I think it's a glorious kind of event that captures something of the absurdity of sport and the pleasures of physical activity that have shaped the history of leisure in the Domain Parklands. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Matthew. I can almost hear all the cheers from the Henley on the Yarra echoing through time. Matthew gave us the river as a key axis in this domain, and our final speaker, Stuart Harrison, is going to have a bit of a look at the shrine and the domain, and we can see there's another very important axis shaping through to the city. So please welcome Stuart.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, so I'm an architect. I'm going to talk a little bit about one particular building project, which is the shrine, and its relationship to the domain more widely. I guess one of the things that I wanted to try and talk to briefly tonight is this idea of building memory, of the idea as a building as a memory, as a collective urban memory. And the domain in this case is the host to that memory. This, I've got a few photographs here, relatively recent photographs by John Gollings, Melbourne's sort of well-known photographer who likes to get up into a helicopter, and you get a sense of the shrine's relationship here back to the city. But I'll mount a very brief argument that that relationship has not always been its key relationship. It also has a relationship to the landscape to the south and to the bay. But those of you familiar with the shrine, which is most of us who live in Melbourne, will know that recent works have extended the shrine quite significantly, and indeed this has been a pattern of development with the shrine since its completion in 1934, a series of extensions, alterations that have pushed it in a certain direction and a certain trajectory. This photograph here, I think, is probably more useful in talking a bit about the shrine's relationship to the rest of the domain, which we've heard so many great insights about tonight. It's obviously also worth mentioning that the shrine, of course, has special significance this year in relation to the centenary of the Anzac landings, and in fact the recent body of work has been finished in preparation for that. So what we see on this, again, this John Gollings photograph, is the shrine's sort of equal distance relationship back to the central city in relation to some other key institutions in the domain, and indeed in the wider domain or park area of Melbourne. So we have the recent rectangular stadium, Amy Park in Melbourne Park, which is sort of not technically part of the domain, but part of that wider region of Melbourne Parklands outside of the grid. We have Government House, which we were hearing a bit about before, finished sometime in the 1870s, I think. We have, of course, the observatory, and we have the shrine itself. So if we look at the shrine, what we see there today is really the combination of 3 generations of work. We can see the original building, which was designed by Hudson and Wardrop, 2 returned servicemen who, inspired by, as we were hearing a bit about before, encounters in the Middle East and certain classical principles, brought a classicising architecture. And then we have works out the front, which were completed, that big cruciform forecourt, completed after the war, completed in 1954 by Fall and Milston. And then we have the recent works, which essentially are visibly located through these 4 sunken courtyards in and around the shrine. And they're the work of architects Ashton, Rackett, McDougall, and landscape architects Rush Wright. In preparation for this talk, I dug up some research conducted by Nigel Westbrook, a former lecturer of mine, now at the University of Western Australia. This is a summary of his master's thesis conducted at RMIT, finished in 1994. And Westbrook makes some very interesting observations that touch on really the development of Government House and then the shrine. This thesis of his concentrates on the domain's development in the 1860s to 1880s, and it's captured through a couple of fantastic large drawings, very large format ink on trace drawings that he did at the time, of which this is one here from around 1880s. This is following the completion of Government House, which you can see there in terms of that little sort of L-shaped, C-shaped object in the centre of the screen. And in this thesis, Westbrook makes the argument that in some ways, in preparation for the completion of Government House, a vista was established. So if you can see from that point, I was just locating, sorry, this laser pointer is not working particularly, but from that central point, that little black zigzag, you can see an area of cleared land. It was cleared to create a view line back to the city. And this is contrasted with an earlier drawing that shows that filled in from 20 years beforehand. So this idea of a viewing vista from the city to Government House was part of the works done at this time to increase the visible importance of Government House as seen from the city. These are reasonably, there we go, yes, thank you. Someone's doing that for me. Subsequently, and the argument is laid, and I've highlighted it here, it's probably a bit hard to read in this bit of text, but this is a precursor to the idea of the Shrine of Remembrance on this key vista down Swanston Street, up St Kilda Road, this key axis of view, which, as you can see at this point in time, is really a sort of loose axis. It gets more and more formalised as time goes on. And really this idea, Westbrook makes the argument, this idea was tested with Government House and then essentially is formalised with the shrine, which of course is built following the Second World War. So the building itself, I'll just talk very briefly about its history. So the idea of it emerges after the calamity of the First World War and a need to remember and memorialise. An architectural competition was held. Hudson and Wardrop won that competition. The image on the left, it had a lot of false starts. The image on the left is a competition drawing, and you can see in this image, you can see the relationship. This is looking south. This is the shrine depicted in its relationship to the wider landscape and Port Phillip Bay. You can see this photograph, aerial photograph, following the completion in 1934 as part of the centenary of Melbourne celebrations, where hundreds of thousands of people turned up for its opening. And you can see the scheme changes in that time, and this cruciform element becomes more formalised. This is a shot here of the construction of the shrine, and the point I wanted to make with this slide is that the shrine essentially remodels and builds the ground. It designs the ground in order to make it a prominent object on that Swanston Street, St Kilda Road axis. And that's been a continuous trajectory in the redevelopment of the shrine. So the photo at the top here, you can see how the hoarding of the site is overlaying existing pathways and roads. There is a myth that some people have that the St Kilda Road axis was moved to make way for the shrine. That curvature was already there, but the shrine puts itself into that axis. And you can see here on this image at the bottom, essentially this underground world being created, which has recently been opened up. The recent works, in fact, have engaged extensively with that mound, the artificial hill. There is a slight hill that the building is formed on, but the building itself becomes its own hill. We heard before that the Museum of Halicarnassus is a precedent, and this, one of the few, all the images of it are post-reconstruction images, but this was an urban building in relation to a bay, and I think there is an argument that Hudson and Wardrop were very conscious of its history and relationship. And then the photo here of that key view that we see when we're in the city, as it was back after completion, looking very white there and bright. This idea of a building that's in a parklands, in the domain, but actually puts itself through the view, so sort of collapsing the view into the city. So that memory, that act of remembrance, is seen constantly, particularly when you're in the city, when you're crossing Swanston Street, which obviously many of us do. Here on the right we see a drawing showing that mounded hill effect, that all that is essentially faked up. The works after we saw before an aerial shot that showed this as well, that there was a reflecting pool in front of the shrine, completion in the 30s. That was demolished after the Second World War, after that large plaza, cruciform plaza was put in. And if we see on the right here, this slide from 1971, when the shrine's, I guess, cultural position was different to what it is today, indeed a sign of protest as the emerging anti-war movement begins to refocus what the shrine's about, and indeed it is vandalised in 1971 with the words peace written across the columns, interestingly shifting the symmetry of the building. But I think the point I'm trying to make here is that in the 20 years to now, as Australian sort of culture has re-engaged with the Anzac mythology, the shrine has benefited from that, and a rather worn-looking shrine here has now been extensively renewed. If we zoom forward to today, the recent works have again extended the shrine. They've made the building bigger without it really being visibly evident that it's bigger, by using this underground space. And we can see here this undercroft space with these fantastic brick columns, and all of that was essentially full of rubble. That's been opened up and now forms the galleries of remembrance. And then the other key architectural and landscape, and there's a blurring here between architecture and landscape, is this element of these sunken courtyards. This is one of the new ones, and this is dedicated to the sort of failed efforts of Australia in that period of the Vietnam War, and the planting is extracted from that period. So in summary, the shrine has been continually updated and extended, and the land and the manipulation of the landscape has been central to this. My final slide is I wrote a recent, and the reason Jeffrey asked me is I wrote a recent article in the design files. So if you want to find out a bit more on the shrine and its history, you can find it out through there, and this idea of kind of building memory. Thank you.
Wow, it's a smorgasbord of wonderful images and ideas about this place. And it strikes me that the Domain is a very complex place, and the word itself, I think, encapsulates some of the perhaps paradoxes. And we think of a domain as being a very expansive sort of place, but a domain is also something, I think, that intrinsically to it has the meaning of someone watching over it, or a sense of someone controlling it. And it came through, I think, all of the presentations. These kind of paradoxes, or perhaps two sides of the same coin. And we had this sort of spectacular big events on the river, the Maya Music Bowl, but also it has the capacity to be a very personal and intimate space. We can get that wonderful optic from the aerial shot, or we can get sort of little vistas from a personal sense from roads or tracks and so on. It's a very organic place, but it's also very highly curated. It's a right royal place, let's say, in some of its nomenclature at least, but it's also a people's place, perhaps a sense of a more kind of democratic place. And also, I derive from the talks, it's a place for visitors and tourists and people from the outside, but it also belongs to a local community as well. So lots of different sides of the same coin. And I guess maybe in just throwing it open to a little discussion before we take some questions from the floor, I wonder whether that makes it, in terms of placemaking, a confusing place in terms of fixing it in the mental map of Melburnians, or doesn't that really perhaps matter?
No, well, I think it does. I think it is a very confusing place because of its ad hoc development, really, over time. It's a very unstructured area, patchwork of reserves which bump into each other, don't really work together necessarily. So I think it'll be a difficult task to work on the master plan, I would imagine. Yeah.
It makes me think of I often think of Melbourne being folded around the river, and we've got the grid on one side, the built form of the city, and the domain on the other side. And I think, if I said to you, let's meet for a chat tomorrow at the Boer War Monument.
Oh, right.
No one would really know maybe where that
I would have a rough idea
you
where
might
it was,
have a rough
but I might
idea.
have to walk a bit before I got there.
So in a way, it does sort of mirror the complexity of the city itself. There are places that maybe it's good that we don't perhaps know so well, because it gives it that kind of exploratory, adventure sort of playground type of feel, that it's a big space that we can move through. We never quite know it, but in a way that could be what is one of its attractions. I mean, some of John's aerial shots that we often don't perhaps see, we think, oh, okay, that's where the Maya Music Bowl is, and we make sense of it in a way that we often don't from the ground.
Yeah, it might be an attraction for people who don't know the domain. I find it a bit irritating, actually, myself, but I imagine that if you didn't know the domain, it'd be quite an adventure exploring it, and ending up, you wouldn't really quite know where.
Matthew, is it a place do you think that Melburnians used to know a little better in terms of the sporting activity that perhaps is, aside from, the remnants in Mooma perhaps, have kind of maybe shifted focus to the sporting precinct down the river a bit?
Yeah, definitely. I think, it's telling that the football used to reschedule or avoid the regattas, whereas now it's much more likely that it's regattas, kind of making sure they don't clash with major sporting events. So I think, we don't flock to the Yarra and to the Domain in the same way. But at the same time, that heartbeat of kind of physical culture around the Tan is kind of, I think, emblematic of a different part of Melbourne and a different way of looking at Melbourne's sporting culture.
Yeah, people flock to the Tan, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I think what you showed us is the way that the river too is a very curated and organised space, and we often think of the river as being this organic place, but of course we know it's changed route and engineered and so on over the years. Okay, we might throw it open to the audience. Anyone who's got a question or a comment? Okay, yep, we'll start up there.
Hello, this is a question for John Hawker. It's about when you're replacing the trees. Are you choosing species still that are in the rare and endangered categories that are, of interest? That's my question.
Right, well, it's a good question. You'd have to ask that to the City of Melbourne, but I would hope out of the master plan there is a pretty serious review of what's there, what has been in terms of species diversity. But until you start looking through the domain, it's somewhat taken for granted that there are gums and elms and oaks and so on. But in fact, it's not until you start identifying each of the gums, and I think that's the first thing that really struck us at Heritage Victoria in 2012, that there are gum trees there that you'd only ever find in the Melbourne Botanic Gardens, and there's a small collection of them that you actually find nowhere else in cultivation in Victoria. So I think the botanical diversity and value certainly needs to be recognised, and there's an opportunity to strengthen that in some cases. I certainly take Georgina's comment about, it's very fragmented and difficult to, fully understand, but in many ways that's kind of been driven by what I regard as pretty much two major developments, the Shrine and the Sydney Maya Music Bowl. And as a result of those developments, there's a lot of change has taken place. And certainly the loss of what was the former grounds of Government House, even though it's to our benefit because it's become public open space, is also what I'd regard as a very significant change in the landscape. But I think there's the opportunity to introduce many more interesting trees into the landscape.
Just further to that previous question, do the Shrine trustees have much input into the species that are planted in the Shrine Reserve, or is it entirely up to the Melbourne City Council? Or indeed, do the people who or the organisations which are being commemorated, are those organisations allowed to have an input into the species chosen? Right.
Well, the Shrine Precinct is really managed by the Shrine trustees. The grounds are maintained by the City of Melbourne or citywide or whoever their contractors are. But in terms of the design of the Shrine grounds, the first really design that came about was in 1933 by Hugh Lineker. And I think from my observation is not all of that was fully implemented. And certainly that circa 1955 oblique aerial, you'll see the Shrine had very little planting about it in about, the mid-1950s. So, from 33 to 55 or thereabouts, a lot of the Shrine had very few trees. What you see there today was really the result of a master plan that I think the trustees commissioned 6 years ago by Michael Wright of Rush Wright, and certainly Ian Shears from the City of Melbourne, and Heritage Victoria, myself, and other interested parties. I can't recall whether or not there was somebody from the Botanic Gardens at that time. I suspect not. But really the decisions that you see and all that new tree planting that has occurred over the last 6 to 7 years is a master plan prepared by Rush Wright. It's new. It's very different to what Hugh Lineker was proposing in 1933. And I'll let you people judge whether or not what you see there today is good or bad. But an initial comment is that I think the trees are too close.
Down the front here.
It's me now? Okay. I have more of a comment, I suppose. I live opposite the Domain, and I see it as being very much used and loved by people in Melbourne. The memorials are fascinating, the sculptures, the pathways. At times, when the music bowl is fenced off, it's terribly annoying that you can't make your way through the Domain. But there's so much going on there. The grottos, the statue of Weary Dunlop where people gather often, fun runs, people meet there and run from there, etc. I think it's very much used by the public and quite, I think certainly the recreational side of it is working very well. I wonder what a master plan, what you're meaning by a master plan, whether it's replanting or what is the idea behind that?
Well, it's...
Well, I
We
think
don't
it's
know.
kind of... Sorry?
Oh, well,
I think there might be a sense that the master plan is, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the City of Melbourne, but the master plan tries to tease out what some of the issues might be. And it sounds like one of the issues, through what I'm understanding, is that there's the domain is a series of territories to some extent that are fenced or sometimes fenced. The Botanic Gardens, Government House, the My Music Bowl, and then sort of invisibly fenced, like the shrines sort of blurry relationship to the rest of it. So again, the question is that good? Is that sort of diversity good, that sort of precinct model, and does that allow for connections through it? Or is there a need to look at it more holistically? I mean, my own sense is that a diversity of experience is good, and the great diversity of tree planting we were hearing about before is incredibly, I would argue, incredibly good, and the sort of diversity of architectural moments in what is an incredibly dense public domain. I mean, there is a lot of stuff going on in there, and it's still legible as an outdoor space primarily. Whether there's a need to improve things like connections, pathways, contemporary ideas like wayfinding. I think that, assuming that's what the master plan will begin to try and address, or whether it's okay for it to have this slightly fragmentary nature. Sometimes you want that.
and also a master plan is designed to try and prevent ad hoc development that's happened a lot in the past, to try and prevent that. So.
Okay, we've got a question down the front. Yep.
Yes, a very quick question for John Hawker, perhaps. Has there been any effort made to preserve and propagate seeds for some of the more endangered species that you've mentioned, that we could perhaps have access to?
I think the more recent planting, and I'm focusing on the what I call the South Domain. It's that area between Domain Road, Birdwood Avenue, Anderson Street in the east, and the Shrine. Certainly some plants there that you see, some oaks and other species have come from the Melbourne Botanic Gardens, and I think over a long period of the history of the domain, as I indicated, that early planting was by Mueller and then Guilfoyle, and perhaps even Cronin did some work as well. Certainly the opportunity presents itself to introduce new species, but also respecting, I think what needs to be understood is, what was Mueller and what was Guilfoyle wanting to, I guess, accomplish in this landscape. The opportunity for tree planting is substantially reduced. We've got many more buildings, we've got new monuments, we've got other roadways, and certainly I think, in a case like that, often you have to cut a tree down to plant a new tree. But certainly, I think the City of Melbourne have indicated in recent years that they're wanting to increase the diversity and the density of the planting in the domain. And that's certainly, if you look at around Dallas Brooks Drive, you'll see that happening.
I was rather dismayed to see from the overall photograph, the John Gollings photograph, just how much of the land is taken up with concrete and construction. The crucifix area, I think, in front of the shrine, is an enormous amount of loss of green space. And I was wondering, I do take your point about needing to have a connection within the domain and relate things, but you did mention something about putting extra pathways in, and I was just thinking that'd be rather sad to lose more greenery and possibly more trees. And I was wondering if there's any thought about maintaining the green space as, to the greatest extent possible, rather than having pathways.
Do you want me to respond
Stuart,
to that?
yeah, and I wonder if you could reflect on perhaps when the shrine itself was built, what sort of response there was to
I mean, I think it's an interesting point that, and I did try to make it, that the amount of hard landscape did increase in '54 when that forecourt was introduced. And in some ways you could argue that's slightly antithetical to the idea of a park setting. It made that sort of axial connection stronger. But what the cruciform does and the grassed area around it, sort of low grassed area, is provide that space for the big events, which is typically Anzac Day dawn service. And I think in the popular consciousness or the civic consciousness, that's obviously a really important gathering space. So the question is, can spaces have more than one job? You know, can they be that assembly space and then be a successful landscape the rest of the time? Like when you go to that forecourt, not on the dawn service, it feels pretty big and it feels pretty empty. And I certainly think the work that Rush Wright have done over the last, I think it's 10 years or so, almost maybe 12 years, to revegetate that area generally has been really good because it was reasonably open. But there is always this idea about keeping these key vistas clear of really anything, vegetation or buildings. So in that sense, I think it's quite a complex answer, and there are design possibilities. Whether there's as much heritage value in the cruciform plaza from 54 as there is in the original shrine, or indeed in the recent works, is arguable. And in relation to more pathways, I think it's about potentially better pathways if there is an issue at the moment, or it doesn't necessarily have to be pathways. I'm certainly not proposing anything because I have no involvement in it at all. But there may be an opportunity to improve, the sense of connection through the domain generally, and there might be various strategies for doing that. I do agree, though, it's unfortunate when the Sydney Mine Music Bowl is fenced off. It's against the original intent of that remarkable piece of work, again, which involves using the ground, and it sort of creates a sense of a commercialised piece of domain, which is regrettable. So I think that is something that the master plan could recommend that doesn't occur anymore.
We think of the domain and other parklands in a sense as the kind of lungs of the city, and we use, I suppose, more contemporary understandings of sort of green infrastructure and so on. Thinking historically, has that consciousness always been there about the domain, that it is a place worth protecting in those terms from the earliest sort of time of Melbourne's settlement, or is it a more recent?
As I said, the idea of creating parks and gardens was a new social tool which started in England, 1830s, something like that. So the idea of, it's hard to say really what they were thinking when they settled Melbourne. They were just surrounded by open space, but they did have this great belief that it would be a huge metropolis, and therefore they were right from the start, very keen to protect green spaces, to create gardens, to keep them. They were very jealous of the government trying to take a bit of it away from them very early on. So I'm sure the domain was always thought of as a big open space that they wanted to keep for public use, apart from the Government House Reserve. But, I don't really know what people thought then. I think that they probably thought a lot of similar things as we think today. They were jealous of the government taking any of their land, their public land. They wanted it to be kept for like today.
I think in some ways it's more important than it was at that
point.
We're
more built up.
19th century anxieties about public space did lead to the creation of the great urban parks, but in a densifying city, in a city that's going to become the largest city in the country in the next 20 years, there is a sense that those outdoor spaces need to work harder for all the variety of sport, recreation, civic functions that need to go in on them. So they actually become more important. So I would think our current thinking should be about both making existing parks better, work better, and creating new ones. They become completely central to the idea of denser living. And whether we're into density or not, it's happening.
Yeah, but how, look at Yarra Park. it's still Yarra Park, but it's filled with buildings for sporting events, and you know what, the whole nature of recreation, what people think about recreation's changed, whether they actually kick a football themselves or watch somebody else doing it or whatever. But it's quite a fraught question. I consider that Yarra Park has gone. You know, it's no longer there, but many people, most people, probably love those buildings and think they're an improvement on what was there before.
I think that's a greater landscape challenge, is to make Yarra Park, Melbourne Park, actually feel like a park again.
Yeah.
That's an interesting design proposition. Yeah. Because, you know, what are the limits of a park? I mean, how many pavilions in a park can you have before it becomes urban form?
Look at the Domain. What can you keep putting into the Domain before it sort of vanishes under more music bowls or more memorials or more this and that? I mean, it's getting fairly crowded now, really.
Yeah, it's very dense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is it kind of set in stone now as a place of memorialisation, or
is it what set
in stone? I mean, have we kind of capped the?
I have no idea. Quite possibly, but I don't know. But who could say in 200 years? Who knows?
I don't think it has to be one thing or the other. I think it could be many things. I mean, I think the sporting discussion, the regatta discussion, which was fascinating. I mean, let's see that again. I mean, outside of the sort of stuff that happens on the river around Moomba, there isn't a lot of that active use stuff that goes on in the river, and there's a massive potential for that, I would have thought, at a recreational level, to bring back a big regatta.
I think one of the really interesting questions for this park is how it continues to evolve into the future, and how much of its current character or its values do we define at this point in time that reflects our cultural associations and our values about preserving global biodiversity or the particular kind of landscape environment that it currently offers. And I think your comparison to Yarra Park is a really good one in the fact that we've allowed that area to be really occupied by active recreation and a whole lot of infrastructure that supports that. And what we have in the Domain is something that still really is about a landscape, and how do we look at making that a contemporary space. And the Shrine's been a really good example of how you can adapt a heritage building in a contemporary way, which isn't defined by its original character but create something new. So I'm interested to hear your views about how we start to define the kinds of values and elements of that park that enables us some freedom to allow it to change.
Well, I don't think I can. This really is the job of the master plan, I think, and I'm glad I'm not working on it. I think it's be a difficult job, but I can't really answer it. I don't know how you do it all. Hopefully the Melbourne City Council does. I don't know.
I think it's an excellent question.
But yeah, Matthew.
But I would quibble a little bit with, because I think something like the Tan is both landscape and a different form of active recreation, you know, that fits gloriously here and brings a whole lot of people for recreation purposes, but in a way that doesn't, you know, radically reshape the landscape like has happened in Melbourne Park. So I think, you know, it's been part of that public health movement, you know, the new public health that emerged out of the 1970s and has done marvellously well. So.
It all happens incrementally though. It's you don't have that one moment when things change. It sort of happens and slowly it happens and suddenly it's happened. Again, it's why you need a master plan to try and manage change.
Yeah, and help.
Because will happen, whatever, but you want to try and manage it.
I think the master plan is needed to try and guide that development. But when I agree with the question, I think the Shrine presents a great example of how to be contemporary, both in a landscape sense and an architectural sense, and how to be entirely respectful at a heritage level, both the heritage landscape and heritage building level, and a cultural level. So I think there is a model there, whether that is replicable in other elements. I mean, greater public use of government house grounds, for example, in its historical trajectory, may be part of the answer too, and the sort of opening up of other elements of the park. But I think there are a lot of clues there. But I think the connections to across the river are potentially something that master plans typically look at. Yeah. Would that help the other side of the river become a bit more like the domain, which could really help it.
And I think that question of the Yarra is kind of a neglected one. Like,
totally.
What can you do? I'm not convinced you could get a regatta in the same way that the handling on the Yarra was. But it can be
But just for the outfits, though.
I think it can be a much more central part again, and something that uses that space in a way where it becomes more layered and more a side of recreation and enjoyment.
Well, absolutely. I think we've seen the river, in the other direction, become re-engaged with generally through the promenade, the South Bank, and sort of activation along there in a more directly architectural way. But I think the idea that the river around this precinct is far more engageable. If you deal with all the things that stop access to it, like big roads, then you can bring it into play in a massive way and make it not that episodic moment of engagement that you get at Moomba, but a sort of continual level of engagement. Some would argue that a river-based water taxi service would do something like that. An old favourite that never seems to happen despite its relatively low cost.
Okay, we're drawing towards the end. We've got about 5 minutes, so if you've got a question that you've been dying to ask.
I have. Firstly, Georgina, I agree with you entirely in regard to Yarra Park. And probably one of the worst aspects is that the state government recently gave the whole management over to the MCC, so it sort of is completely lost. We call it a car park. John, I just wondered, recently in looking around Government House Garden, I was interested how few elm trees there are there. Did there used to be and they haven't been replaced, or were they never there?
Oh, certainly on the 1869 plan that was drawn under Mueller's direction, there was certainly quite a number of elm plantings indicated. As for the trees along Linlithgow Avenue and elsewhere, well, they've all come much later in terms of the planning of the domain, probably the early 1900s. As for the Government House grounds, look, from my memory, there were never large numbers of elm trees in the Government House grounds, not even in the area that was excised in 1933. The really principal trees in the Government House grounds, and the number of illustrations of this by Guilfoyle was that he used araucarias and boldleaf plants and certainly eucalypts. And if you go through G Gate today, what's known as the Huntingfield Lawn, part of that was originally the grounds of Government House, and it's really a good indication of what was planted in the Government House grounds, and there are cupressus and eucalypts and pinus and so on. So as I indicated in my presentation, that Monterey pine and Monterey cypress, I would have thought that at the turn of the century, and certainly up until about 1911, you would have had many, many more conifers, particularly pines and cypress, throughout all of the domain, but also the occasional elm and oak as well.
Yes, up the back.
I've got a slightly vested interest here because I run the Botanic Gardens, but I just want to... I was interested in the conversation about the river, and I suppose thinking too about what the heart of the domain is, and in some ways, because I sit in the Botanic Gardens, I feel that is, but that's because that's where I'm based. But for us, when we're looking forward to our planning, we certainly see the river as a huge opportunity for the Botanic Gardens, at the moment it really blocks itself off from there. It's a bit of a hedge, a bit of a rundown fence, and almost looks like it doesn't want to know the river's there. And if you go across the other side with the observatory, where we have plans for a science precinct, and we'd like to sort of enliven that, if you like, and bring out the astronomy and the botany as well. So both sides of the gardens could be activated, and I think part of it's not the answer to that sports field we've been talking about across the river, but connecting across there perhaps with the landscape, even from the Botanic Gardens in some visual way, might start to soften that a bit. So I see it's full of potential, and I think the master plan can help bring, not lock the gardens up, if you like, but make the gardens more a feature of the whole domain and really let it bleed and connect out into the domain more. So I'll stop there. I'll tell you all about our plans.
Thank you. Perhaps maybe a final comment on that or otherwise from the panellists before we wrap up?
I mean, I'm not aware of the status of the Botanic Gardens' own master plan versus the wider domain master plan, but obviously an integrated master plan tends to be a good way of pushing these things forward. And so if you've got this sort of territorial issue, I mean, the Shrine's had its own master plan now implemented. The next evolution of all those sort of sub-master plans, in a way, if you look at the bigger, greater domain, I think my sort of advice would be that they're essentially integrated.
Well, I agree. Any master plan has to go beyond its borders, and there's not a brick wall around the boundary of the domain. It has to meet the other areas and join properly and work properly. Yep.
But I think that's also right in terms of the opportunity of the Yarra there with the gardens. Like it seems like a really clear, a promising site for much, better use of the Yarra and incorporating it in ways where it strengthens and layers the possibilities there.
Any final words?
Well, I'll say that the domain and the Government House grounds and the Botanic Gardens isn't just about the trees. In a way, it is. And really, the master planning process in terms of understanding the landscape, the trees, and you saw that in that Golling aerial, the positioning of where golden elms or golden poplars might be, and the variety of form within that landscape is really important to understand. And clearly, with the technology today, to try and analyse that planting character is highly significant, because what's going to happen, and I'm guaranteed, is that the trees will die, they have to be removed, and new trees have to be planted, not this year, not just this year, but for the next hundreds of years. So thanks.
Terrific. Thank you, John. Well, look, I think it's been a terrific opportunity to draw some lines, if you like, conceptually, in a way, between the sort of past and the present through to the future, and thinking about ways of understanding and historicising, and perhaps, in a sense, fixing or at least marking some of the tangible and intangible values of this space in a way that can deal with perhaps with known future needs, as well as the kind of unknown unknowns that a space like this needs to encapsulate. So thank you to the panel. Before we go, I'll remind you that this is part one of a two-part discussion, and by all means you're very welcome to come along next week to part two, which is really a discussion of the Domain Parklands future next Wednesday evening. I'd especially like to thank a couple of people, Geoffrey Taylor, who's pulled this whole show together on behalf of the City of Melbourne, Melbourne Conversations series. I'd also like to thank Angela Hill and Kathy Kiss in particular, also Federation Square and Future Leaders, and their director, Dr. Helen Sykes, AM. If you want to keep in the loop about future events, there's some sheets up the back that you can put your contact details on as you leave. There's some brochures there that you can also pick up. And also get onto the Participate Melbourne site, and it's where, in a sense, we are all, from our different perspectives, stakeholders in this question, and a sense of the importance of community engagement in this around the master plan is particularly important. So there's an opportunity for you to get involved. And can you thank me in joining the organisers and our panellists for a really stimulating discussion tonight?